Hey y'all, how are you doing? I'm great. Thank you so much for asking. It's me, Kim, and I'm back for another video. This video is a conversation with historian Richard Rothstein. He's a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute, as well as a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Now, I wanted to talk to Mr. Rothstein because he wrote this incredible book called The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. And we basically discussed how everything comes back to residential segregation, health, wealth, education, all of it. We had a wonderful, deeply thoughtful and in-depth conversation about this. I so appreciated his time. Here it is. First of all, Mr. Rothstein, I appreciated The Color of Law so much because it allows us to connect historic struggle to contemporary events. And I really do think it's very timely. Yeah.
Yes, you're not the only one who thinks that.
I'm sure. So to get started, I learned way back in high school in AP government that there are two kinds of segregation. And there's de jure segregation that was mandated by law. And then there was de facto segregation, which is when laws don't overtly create inequality. You posit that binary is a myth. And why do you think that?
Well, you're right. That's the theme of my book. De facto segregation is the idea that the only reason that we have such a segregated society where every metropolitan area in the country has clearly defined areas that were all white or mostly white and still are, clearly defined areas that were all black or mostly black and still are. The only reason for that is because of bigoted homeowners or real estate agents who wouldn't sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or maybe people just like to live with each other of the same race, or maybe it was businesses in the private economy, not government agencies, businesses like real estate agencies and banks that discriminated, or maybe it's just because African Americans on average have lower incomes than whites and therefore can't afford to live in middle-class white neighborhoods. All of these individual, personal, bigoted decisions is the reason we have segregation. It's not like the segregation we had in the 20th century of lunch counters or buses or trains or schools or colleges, which was required by government. This is all just an accident. And the Supreme Court has said that if you have this kind of segregation that caused by accident, they call it de facto segregation, as you mentioned. If you have de facto segregation, it's not a constitutional violation, it's not a civil rights violation, and government is not permitted, according to the Supreme Court, to fix it. Well, it turns out, as you indicated, it's a total myth. The reality is that the apartheid system that we have today, the segregation of every metropolitan area, was the creation of racially explicit government policy that ensured that African Americans and whites could not live near one another. There are many examples. They all interacted. When I started writing my book, I knew about a few of them, but I never had any idea what I was going to discover about the many policies at the federal, state, and local level that were explicitly racial, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites couldn't live near one another. The result of that understanding is that residential segregation, because it was created on a racially explicit basis by government policy, is a constitutional violation. It's as much of a constitutional violation as segregation of public schools or interstate transportation or public accommodations. And if it's a constitutional violation, a civil rights violation, we're obligated as Americans to redress it, to fix it. That's our obligation as American citizens under the Constitution, to enforce the Constitution, to fix civil rights violations. So understanding this distinction is not just a historical curiosity. It has enormous implications for how we move forward. If we think we have de facto segregation, we may think it's too bad, but there's not much we can do about it. We just have to hope it unhappens accidentally. If we understand it's a constitutional violation, what you refer to as de jure segregation, then we can't simply sit by and let it continue. We have an obligation as Americans to do something to fix it.
Yeah. What made you want to write this book?
Well, I was a writer about education policy. I didn't know much about housing. I knew a little bit. Obviously, I have to say honestly, nobody writes a book without having, takes years to do the research to write a book if he doesn't have an idea that he's going to find out something worth writing about. So I had a little bit of an idea about it, but no idea at all about how interlocking all these policies were and how powerful they were to determine the segregation we have today. I was writing about education. I was the education columnist at the New York Times for a while. I wrote about education policy for the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. That's what I was doing. And I came to understand that the education policy that we were following in this country made no sense. It was a theory that underlie our national education policy, that the only reason that African American children achieved at lower levels than white children on average was because teachers had low expectations for Black children and didn't try hard to get them to learn. And the theory was if only we could get teachers to try harder, right, the achievement gap would disappear. And we actually enacted this ludicrous theory in a law called the No Child Left Behind law, which required schools to test children every year and punish schools and teachers if the scores didn't rise. And the idea was if you held them accountable for the test scores, the achievement gap would disappear. And as an education policy analyst, I understood this was nonsense. The reason we have an achievement gap between Black and white children in this country is primarily because of the social and economic conditions that children come to school with. So I remember writing one column about asthma. As you probably know, African American children in low-income neighborhoods in this country have asthma at 4 times the rate of white children. 4 times the rate. They have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through their neighborhoods, more deteriorated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And I try to explain that if a child has asthma, that child might be up to a greater extent than a child without asthma, up at night wheezing, coming to school the next day drowsy because the child hadn't had a good night's sleep. And I tried to explain if you had two groups of children who were identical in every respect, 2 identical groups of children, same racial composition, same social and economic background, same family structure, same economic circumstances, except one group had a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group was inevitably going to have lower achievement simply because more of the children in that group would be coming to school drowsy and sleepless. And no matter how high teacher expectations were, you can't make a child wide awake if the child hasn't had a good night's sleep the night before. You can expect them to, but it's not going to do any good. So, and I began to write about many of these conditions that disadvantaged low-income children, particularly African-American children in low-income neighborhoods have, that predict lower achievement, not just asthma, but lead poisoning, homelessness, economic insecurity. You add them all up and you explain the achievement gap. And then I realized that if you have a school where you concentrate children, where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity or poor nutrition, that school can't possibly be expected to achieve at a level of a school where children come to school healthy and well-rested and well-nourished and in secure economic environments. Well, we call those schools segregated schools. And schools are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated in this country. So I came to think of neighborhood segregation as an educational problem. I still wasn't thinking about housing. I thought it was an educational problem. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court was investigating the policies of 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of them had a very, very token school desegregation plan. It was a plan that allowed parents to choose which school their child would go to within the district. But if the parent's choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of a choice of a child who would not do so. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, and there was a one place left in that school, and both a black and a white child applied for that last place, the black child would be given some preference in hopes of desegregating the school. It's a trivial program. I mean, how often do you have one place left in the school and both the black and the white child apply for it? This is not exactly a commonplace occurrence, but the Supreme Court denounced this plan. They said you couldn't do such a thing. They said you couldn't do it because the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I thought that was a pretty wise observation on Chief Justice John Roberts' part. He wrote the controlling opinion. And then he went on to say that the neighborhoods are segregated de facto for all the reasons I just described: private bigotry, actions in the private economy, people wanting to live with each other of the same race, income differences. And he said, if you have de facto segregation, there's nothing that the school districts or government of any level is permitted to do about it. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered hearing about something in Louisville, Kentucky, one of these two school districts, some years before, where a white homeowner in a single family home in an all-white suburb of Louisville called Shively had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child. He wanted to buy a single-family home. He could afford one, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought a second home and resold it to his African-American friend in his neighborhood. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. The police didn't stop them from throwing rocks through the windows. They dynamited and firebombed the home, and the police made no effort to stop that. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home to an African-American in a white neighborhood. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, is involved in maintaining racial boundaries in Louisville. I looked into it a bit further. I found there were hundreds and hundreds of cases of police-protected, sometimes police-led and organized mob violence that drove African Americans out of homes they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of those where the police was involved was a constitutional violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment, civil rights violation that we have an obligation to remedy. Well, I looked into it further and I found it wasn't just police-guided violence that created racial boundaries in this country. There were many, many other federal, state, and local policies, racially explicit, that were designed to impose segregation on this country. And without those policies, we would not have the segregation that we have today.
Yeah. What year was the Shively case?
It was in the 1950s. Exact year, I think mid-1950s sometime.
Yeah. So not that long ago, right? Like younger than my grandparents, about as old as my mom. Yeah. Okay, so I'm sure that proponents of a colorblind ideology have approached you and said, okay, well, why do we have to make it about race? Why not just approach it from socioeconomic? Like, why don't we just make it so that poor people can have better access to quality housing?
Well, the reality is that these policies by the police, by federal government, to impose segregation were not directed at poor people. They were directed at African Americans. The homeowner, the African American, the decorated Navy veteran, he wasn't poor. He was a middle-class guy. He had a job. He could afford a home, a single-family home. He was prohibited on a racial basis, not on a social and economic basis, from moving to Shively. And let me give you, I'll give you one example of why this racial policy still imposes segregation today. It's not an economic policy. In the post-World War II period, the federal government embarked on a program to suburbanize the entire white working class population into single-family homes in suburbs like Shively. We weren't a suburban country at that time. The only people living in suburbs were affluent people. They typically constructed their own homes or had their own homes constructed. They weren't in giant subdivisions for the most part. There were a few exceptions. And white working class and black working class families were all living in center cities, frequently in integrated neighborhoods, much more integration then than we have now, for the simple reason that we were a manufacturing economy. There was none of this internet stuff. We were making things. Yeah. And the factories had to be located in a central district near a deep water port or a railroad terminal to get their parts and ship their final products. So you had both white working class and black working class families all living in center cities at that time. The federal government began a program designed to suburbanize the entire white working class population into single family homes in all white suburbs. It was a racially explicit program. The most famous of these, I don't know where you are, but east of New York City, Levittown, it was called, still there today, was the most famous of these. 17,000 homes in one place. But there were equally large suburbs elsewhere in the country, south of San Francisco, Westlake, 15,000 homes, south of Los Angeles, Lakewood, just as large, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, everywhere.
There were a couple of different Levitt towns. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah. The first one was built east of New York City in Nassau County, and then he built others as well, also on a segregated basis.
Yeah.
Levitt, to take that example, could never have assembled the capital on his own to build 17,000 homes in one place. As I said, we weren't a suburban country. The banks thought this was a crazy idea. Nobody was going to lend him the money to buy the land and build 17,000 homes, for which he didn't have any buyers yet. The only way he could assemble the capital to build this subdivision was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development, the materials he was going to use for construction, the architectural design, the layout of the streets, all his plans, and a required commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The federal government even required Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. This was written in the federal policy manual for appraisers, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders to create these subdivisions. The manual said you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a builder who would sell to African Americans in a white neighborhood. The manual said you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white development that was located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. This de facto notion is a total nonsense. This was a federal policy. Well, that subdivision was built, as were many others across the country. We became a suburban country with the white working class living primarily in suburbs, no longer in cities. Those homes at the time were inexpensive. They sold for $9,000, $8,000 a piece. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Those homes in Levittown or any of these other developments that I described no longer sell for $100,000.
Right.
They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some places $1 million. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next few generations wealth from the appreciation and the value of their home. They had equity. Equity in homes is the main way that Americans gain wealth in this country. The white families who gained that wealth became middle class, no longer working class. They became middle class. They, as a result of the wealth they had gained, they sent their children to college. They used it to take care of perhaps emergencies, maybe temporary unemployment. If you lose a job for a short period of time, if you have wealth, you can weather that emergency. If you don't have wealth, you push further down the economic scale. And they use it to subsidize their retirements and to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this wealth-generating exercise. Continued living in rented apartments, either in public housing or rented apartments in urban areas. Today, on average, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. That's a disparity. It's a whole different story behind that. I'm not going to go into that now, but just take it, the 60% income ratio. You'd think that if families have a similar income, 60% income ratio for Black families, they have similar wealth. Their families can save the same amount from their incomes, regardless of race. But in fact, African American incomes are 60% of white incomes on average, but African American wealth is only 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century and it's never been remedied. This was not a policy directed at low-income families. White working-class families were able to move to suburbs with this policy. It was a policy specifically directed at African Americans. The wealth gap that persists to this day as a result of this mid-20th century policy, the wealth gap predicts much of the racial inequality that we have today. That's why we have African Americans living concentrated in low-income neighborhoods. That's why we have an achievement gap in schools that I talked about before, because we've concentrated the most disadvantaged children in single schools and single neighborhoods. It's why we have health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because they live in less healthy neighborhoods, less access to fresh food, more pollution. It predicts police abuse that we've paid so much attention to, thankfully paid attention to in the last couple of months, because police behave like an occupying force in low-income segregated neighborhoods, much like police forces in colonial countries, and India did, in the Congo, throughout Africa. This is the role of police when you concentrate the most disadvantaged people in single neighborhoods. I'm not suggesting that if we did not impose this segregation, that police wouldn't act in discriminatory ways, but it would not nearly be so serious as it is today. Just imagine, the reason that we know about the murder of George Floyd is because someone had a cell phone camera. Before cell phone cameras, this went on all the time, and we never knew about it. If African Americans weren't concentrated away from everybody else, we would have known about this.
Occasionally, there were some riots.
There were riots, but yeah, absolutely. But let me just say one other thing. This wealth gap and the segregation that we've created predicts also the very, very dangerous and frightening political polarization that we have in this country today. Because, it largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial. But how can we ever expect to develop the common identity, common national identity that's essential to the preservation of a democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other, that we have no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to understand each other's life experiences? How do we ever develop a common national identity in those circumstances? So it's an ongoing issue. It's not a policy that's directed at poor people. We can't solve it simply by directing remedies to poor people alone. We need affirmative action in housing for African Americans that will help to redress these civil rights violations. They're constitutionally required, and I hope that the attention that's been directed to racial inequality as a result of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations will move on to address the underlying cause of these problems, which is to large extent residential segregation that was created in violation of the Constitution.
Yeah. You said something that I find to be really interesting. You think some of the tension, the racial tension and violence we're seeing is because of the distance, the lack of proximity between people of different races?
Yes, I think so. The police in this country have adopted the stance of an occupying force. Yeah. The habits they develop are not developed in white neighborhoods. They're developed in Black neighborhoods where there's very little supervision of them by the broader population. Stop and frisk, for example, that would never be tolerated in a predominantly white neighborhood. It goes on in many Black communities where young men are unconstitutionally stopped and searched when there's no probable cause to believe they are a danger to the community. So this only happens because we have segregated low-income families who are African American in separate neighborhoods.
Okay, so I want to make sure that we underscore how important and instrumental federal policy was here. So could you talk a little bit more about how the Federal Housing Administration made it extremely difficult and in many cases impossible for Black people to get federal housing loans in these new suburban communities?
Well, that's what I just described. The Federal Housing Administration would not guarantee loans for builders of these suburban communities if they were going to sell on an integrated basis, on a non-discriminatory basis.
And there were people who wanted to. There are developers who wanted to have integrated communities, and they were barred from it.
That's right. No, I in my book, The Color of Law, I describe a great a great white writer, Wallace Stegner, a great American novelist who was offered a job at Stanford University after World War II, teaching writing. He moved to Palo Alto. There was a housing shortage after World War II. He joined a cooperative of middle-class, working-class families. They bought a large tract of land outside Stanford University. They proposed to build 400 homes there with this cooperative. They went to the Federal Housing Administration to try to get a loan, insurance for a loan to build this development. The Federal Housing Administration would not give them a loan because this cooperative had 100 members in the cooperative. 3 of them were African American. And unless those 3 were kicked out of the cooperative, the Federal Housing Administration would not insure the loan. Eventually, Stegner and his fellow cooperative members, and these were not rich people. At that time, college professors weren't paid very well. These were, mail carriers and school teachers and construction workers. These were working class, lower middle class families. They eventually had to disband the cooperative. They had to resell the land that they had bought to build this subdivision to a private builder who then put clauses in the deeds of every home that he built in this area, prohibiting African Americans from occupying them. So yes, this was a group of people that wanted to build a subdivision outside Stanford University. It had 3 African American members in it, and on that basis, the Federal Housing Administration refused to permit them to go ahead.
Yeah. So you've talked about the restrictive covenants, which were ruled unconstitutional. Could you give us a little bit of a primer on redlining?
Sure. Redlining is a term that's now used to describe the whole plethora of policies that the government followed. But it actually describes only a very narrow aspect of these policies, and that is that the federal, up to now, we've been talking about how the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration effectively prohibited African Americans from moving to suburbs that were predominantly white. Redlining refers to a different policy, which is the refusal of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration to insure mortgages, not loans for developers, but mortgages for African Americans in existing low-income African American neighborhoods. The federal government in the 1930s drew maps of every metropolitan area in the country. Well, not everyone, most of them. They colored red the areas where they thought it was too risky for the federal government to insure mortgages. And the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration pretty much followed those maps. The maps colored red the communities that they thought were too risky. And the primary reason for coloring a community red was because African Americans were living in it.
Yeah. So it's so deeply depressing that if you compare a map of where Black people own homes today to a map of the redlined zones 100 years ago, those maps look very, very similar and sometimes almost identical.
You're absolutely right. The wealth gap that we created has locked African Americans in to many of the same neighborhoods that they lived in 50, 60, 70 years ago. And if you take these red line maps that were created, it was by a federal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. You take these maps and you overlay it on racial residential patterns today, there are great similarities. They're not identical. Obviously, African Americans have moved out of many areas that where they were living in the mid-20th century. So they're not absolutely identical, but they're very, very similar.
Yeah, yeah. Could you talk a little bit about the role that highways played in creating residential segregation?
Sure. As I said, there were many, many federal, state, and local policies that interacted. Yeah. That was what I found so stunning about the research I was doing for this book. It's not that it was one policy. It was so many of them, and each of them played a role. I think the most important one was probably the one we've been talking about most so far, and that is the FHA and VA policies. Mm-hmm. But there were many, many others. One of them, the federal highway system that you just referred to, the federal government began to build highways across the country in the mid-1950s, and local public officials were permitted to design the routes of the highways when they went through cities. And in some cases, the highways were designed to create barriers between Black and white neighborhoods. A good example of that is Chicago, where the Dan Ryan Expressway was routed through the South Side in a way to create a barrier between Black and white neighborhoods. In other cases, the highways were designed to destroy existing Black neighborhoods that mayors and other planners thought were too close to where whites were living and working, and to force African Americans to move to farther away, isolated, segregated areas. A good example of that is Miami, where the Overtown community was destroyed, a healthy, vibrant Black neighborhood destroyed by a highway that was deliberately planned to go through it to move Blacks away from where they were living into a more distant, segregated neighborhood.
Yeah, yeah. Another thing I thought was really fascinating, and it makes sense that your work in education policy would lead you here, is the discussions of how Southern cities use school placement to reinforce segregation. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. As you know, prior to 1954, schools were segregated in southern states by law. Blacks and white children could not attend the same schools. Well, the cities themselves were integrated in many cases in the South. You know, we had segregated lunch counters, segregated buses, segregated schools, but integrated neighborhoods. Largely because of what I talked about before. Black and white workers didn't have cars to drive to work. They had to be able to walk to work. So if you had factories that were employing both Black and white workers, they typically lived in the same broad neighborhoods. I'm not saying every other house was a different race, but broadly the same neighborhoods. Well, what planners in many southern cities did in order to create residential segregation was they decided in their plans where a Black neighbor should be and where a white neighborhood should be. And then they placed schools for Blacks and whites in those places to force families to move to those areas if they wanted their children to be educated. Mm-hmm. So the cities like Raleigh and Houston and Atlanta, others as well, used this device, the placement of schools, to force the movement of African Americans. It wasn't forced in the sense that they were soldiers with bayonets forcing them to move, but if they wanted their children to go to school, they had to move to the only place where there were schools for Black children, and in some cases, whites had to move in order to go to schools where white children were permitted. And so this placement of schools in several southern cities, was an important player in the creation of residential segregation.
Yeah.
We think today, we said at the beginning of our talk, we think of the opposite. We think of residential segregation creating school segregation. But in many parts, cities in the South, it was the opposite. It was the school segregation that created the neighborhood segregation.
Yeah. Something I really appreciated was in an interview with NPR, you said that we can't just explain this stuff away by saying that that was the standard of the time, because a lot of people dissented, a lot of people tried to make different choices, and they were rebuffed, they were pushed back anytime they tried to make any kind of progress. I really, really appreciated that.
Yes, well, you can't say that people didn't know any better. Or at least you can't say that people couldn't have known better. It's not like this was something that people never thought about. We started talking about Levittown. There was a committee of white residents in Levittown called the Committee to End Segregation in Levittown. There was opponents to it. They didn't get very far. William Levitt wasn't interested in desegregating Levittown, but there was a committee of white residents who wanted to do so. Certainly, the NAACP and other organizations of African Americans protested. So their ideas were out there and available to people to consider. There were also public officials who objected to this policy. And wives of public officials, perhaps the most famous opponent of the racial policies of the Roosevelt administration was Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, who, as you know, he was paralyzed. It was very difficult for him to get around the country. She was his eyes and ears and traveled extensively around the country. And the more she went to Black neighborhoods and met African Americans, the more she came to understand the outrage that segregation was. And she tried to impress upon him the necessity of having a more progressive racial policy. So it's not like people didn't know any better, or at least couldn't have known any better. It's not that the wrongness of this policy was inaccessible to people.
We have these Supreme Court decisions that bar explicit discrimination. And then in 1968, we get the Fair Housing Act. But it seems like there's still quite a bit of discrimination in housing going on right now. What went wrong?
Well, there are two aspects of this. One is that, yes, you're right, the Fair Housing Act is not being adequately enforced. The Fair Housing Act prohibits ongoing discrimination. It's not well enforced. Real estate agents still direct African Americans away from white neighborhoods. We've had a number of studies that demonstrate that. There was a very important study by a newspaper, Long Island Newsday, where fortunately New York State doesn't have a two-way consent law for recording a conversation. So they had testers go to real estate agents wearing hidden cameras and were able legally to record their interactions with real estate agents, and they demonstrated the quite substantial extent of real estate agents who continue to discriminate in how they showed homes and sold homes. Banks don't explicitly discriminate all the time, but sometimes they do. There was a number of court cases that demonstrated that the subprime lending crisis was partially attributable to the racially explicit actions of banks to sell exploitative mortgages to African Americans and African American communities on a racial basis, because the banks thought that Blacks were too stupid to understand what they were entitled to. So these are violations of the Fair Housing Act continue. But even if the Fair Housing Act were fully enforced, that would not itself undo the damage that we did on an unconstitutional basis, because as I explained earlier, the wealth gap is an ongoing cause of residential segregation. So, we said, the Fair Housing Act, we talked about Levittown before. In effect, the 1968 Fair Housing Act said, okay, Black people, you can now move to Levittown. But Levittown is no longer affordable. to African Americans who could have moved there when whites were moving there and when it was affordable to black and whites together. So today, as a result of the Fair Housing Act, Levittown is about 2% African American.
Wow.
In a broader area, that's about 15% African American. So, I calculate, I say that that difference between the 2% and the 15% is the ongoing consequence of the civil rights violations that the government imposed in the 20th century that needs remedy.
It did seem like for a while, we were doing really good with trying to make progress in legislation that barred racial discrimination in housing. But I was wondering, how significant was the Supreme Court case Village of Arlington Heights versus Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation in preventing or stopping some of that progress that happened?
One of the ways that we maintain segregation is through zoning laws and decisions of local authorities to permit or not to permit development. And if you have a community that is segregated, an all-white community, or predominantly white community, that, as I said before, was once affordable to African Americans, but has appreciated in value, so it's no longer affordable. The only way that African Americans can move to communities like that is if the communities are not zoned for single-family homes only, if they're permitted, if developers are permitted to build townhouses and duplexes and low-level apartments, for example. That's the only way that integration can begin in those communities, although I do think that, as I said before, we need an affirmative action program in housing that would subsidize African Americans to move to single-family homes as well. But the Supreme Court decision that you name permitted local towns to zone and rezone land to effectively prohibit developers from building homes in which African Americans can live, so long as they didn't explicitly say that the reason they were rezoning it was to keep black people out. And so in many cases, land was rezoned for parks if they thought that black people were going to be able to move to an area the developer was developing, or rezoned for some other purpose, other public purpose. And the effect of this was to give cities pretty much blank authority to create zoning rules that in effect excluded African Americans, even though the rules aren't specifically racially motivated or expressed as a racial motivation. And let me say that we have many, many policies today that are race neutral, that perpetuate racial segregation. It's not just zoning. And one of the problems with our current legal system is that the Supreme Court today has very, very narrow rules for prohibiting a policy that is discriminatory in effect if it doesn't explicitly say that it's done for racial reasons. One of the ones that I've been writing about lately is African Americans in predominantly black neighborhoods pay higher property taxes for property that's the same value as white properties where the families pay lower property taxes. And the reason for that is not because of an assessment policy that is explicitly and openly directed at African Americans, but one reason is that the white neighborhoods appreciate in value faster than black neighborhoods do. So over time, if assessments aren't done very, very frequently, if reassessments aren't done very, very frequently, the distance between the actual market value of a home and the assessed value grows much more rapidly in a white neighborhood than in a black neighborhood. So if whites are paying property taxes on the assessed value of their homes, they're not paying anything near like property taxes on the market value of the homes, whereas blacks, if they're paying property taxes on the assessed value of their homes, it's much closer to the market value of their homes. whites are much more sophisticated generally because they tend to be better educated, partly because of the segregated systems that we've had, in challenging their assessments. So their assessments get reduced more frequently than African Americans do. There are other reasons as well, but this is a policy. The tax assessment policies are, what the term we typically use is they have a disparate impact on African Americans. Mm-hmm. But it's very, very difficult to challenge these in court, and so they perpetuate racial segregation. And it should be easier to challenge them in court.
Yeah. So how did you feel about the 2015 Supreme Court case that it's called Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus the Inclusive Communities Project, and that recognized that disparate impact is a means of racial discrimination? Do you feel at all heartened by that decision?
Well, a little heartened, because although they recognized that you could have a finding that a policy had a disparate impact on African Americans, that's what that decision found. The conditions that the Supreme Court placed on actually having that finding are so restrictive that it's very, very difficult to make that conclusion. You should know about that decision. It was an important decision. I'm not minimizing the importance of the decision, because on that, it can be expanded and built upon. But the Supreme Court in that decision, it was based on the fact that in Dallas, low-income housing was being predominantly placed in low-income neighborhoods, even though it was not said a racially explicit policy. It's easier to build low-income housing in low-income segregated minority neighborhoods, so builders do that. Well, the Supreme Court said this could have a disparate impact and be a violation of the Fair Housing Act if a community placed a disproportionate share of its housing for low-income minority families in low-income minority neighborhoods. But the Supreme Court didn't actually find that the Dallas policy did have disparate impact. It just said it could. And when it was kicked down to the lower courts didn't find that it was a disparate impact. Yeah. Now, it's a good consequence of that decision was that even though the lower courts didn't require it to do so, the housing authorities in Texas and Dallas began, as a result of that decision, to place more housing for African Americans and Hispanics in higher opportunity places as a result. Yeah. But it was not because they were required to do so by the court. So it was a good decision, but in practice, it didn't have a big effect because the conditions that the Supreme Court placed on finding a disparate impact were very, very complex and narrow.
Yeah. All right. So let's continue talking about politics. Let's talk about everybody's favorite person, Donald Trump. Okay. So recently, Donald Trump tweeted out, I have to read it, "I am happy to inform all of the people living their suburban lifestyle dream that you will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood." So there he's referring to his administration's reversal of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule from 2015. Now, we know that Donald Trump is opposed to anything Obama era, but when I read that, not knowing anything about that rule, it set off some like racially coded alarm bells for me. And I'm wondering, is Donald Trump, when he is talking about reversing that rule, is he appealing to racial animus, do you think?
Well, I think it speaks for itself. I'm not going to talk about Donald Trump, but I will talk about the rule.
Okay.
I think it speaks for itself. The Obama administration adopted a rule that required suburbs, but all communities, to do an analysis of how they came to be so segregated and to come up with a plan to undo that segregation. That's, in simple terms, what the rule did. And the rule held out the possibility that if communities came up with such plans and didn't implement them, that the federal government would withhold funds from federal funds, for sidewalks or sewers or, anything that the communities get federal funds for. Hold up funds to those suburbs if they didn't implement their desegregation plans. Well, that's the rule that the Trump administration has revoked. Communities no longer have to do this kind of assessment of their history of discrimination. They no longer have to come up with effective plans. But it's all symbolic, because even under the Obama administration rule, the time when the federal government would be withholding funds from jurisdictions that didn't implement plans to desegregate would have been far in the future. There was actually no implementation of that prior to the Obama administration leaving office. So the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule did not result in federal requirements that housing that could have minority residents be placed in suburbs that didn't have them. There was a much more, I will say, we've taken big steps backwards in this area in some respects. In 1970, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, George Romney, the father of the present Utah senator, recognized the role that the federal government played in creating segregation on an unconstitutional basis. George Romney said that the federal government has created a white noose around Black neighborhoods in urban areas, and it's the federal government's responsibility to untie that noose. And he proposed a rule that was very similar, a policy that was very similar to the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule the Obama administration implemented. The rule, he called it the Open Communities Policy. He didn't call it the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act. It was the same thing. He threatened to withhold federal funds from suburbs that didn't redress their segregation, that didn't open themselves up to African Americans in particular. He actually went much farther than the AFFH rule in the Obama administration. Romney actually withheld funds from 3 suburbs because they refused to desegregate. One was a suburb of Detroit, one was a suburb of Baltimore, one was a suburb of Cleveland. The Nixon administration, reflecting the views of it was building a racial politics, reflecting the views of its white supporters, forced Romney to disband the Open Communities program, to issue the funds that he had been withholding to those 3 communities, and forced Romney out of office so that we no longer have the Open Communities program. My conclusion from that is that without a new civil rights movement, it doesn't matter what kinds of policies the federal government enacts, because there was no civil rights movement that was active enough in 1970 to defend the Romney Open Communities plan. And we need a new civil rights movement to now, that if in a new administration, a new Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule is adopted, that there will be enough political support to sustain it to the point where it actually does have the effect of remedying some of these civil rights violations.
Yeah. So I've heard you say that because the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century was so focused on school desegregation, that housing desegregation kind of got left to the wayside, and that's why you endorse having a new kind of civil rights movement. Do you think it even would have been possible to focus on both things at the same time, or we were just doing the best we could?
Well, it's I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. The NAACP, which is the leading civil rights organization of the 20th century, began its campaign to desegregate schools in a very, very deliberate way. It began in the 1930s by challenging segregation in law schools. It then used those precedents to challenge desegregation in colleges and universities, public colleges and universities. It then used that as the basis for Brown versus Board of Education. That was a 20-year process. When this started, and the NAACP, which was a courageous organization that was doing this litigation, its director at that time was Thurgood Marshall. Right. It was a very careful, slow, deliberate strategy. But it was a nickel and dime organization, actually more nickels than dimes. It supported itself with members' dues, very modest dues. It got one foundation grant in, I think it was 1933 or thereabouts, to challenge school segregation. The policies of residential segregation that the federal government was following hadn't really yet existed at that time. They grew gradually. The FHA wasn't established until 1934. The Veterans Administration wasn't established until after World War II. So the NAACP was absorbed in the fight against school desegregation. And by the time it had won that fight in 20 years, in 1954, and then it was consumed after that by having to defend that decision. As you know, there was no voluntary compliance with Brown versus Board of Education. So all its resources were consumed in defending the Brown decision. By the time that was done, the segregated patterns that we have in this country residentially have been well and firmly established. They've been created by the federal government. Yeah. On the day after Brown versus Board of Education decision came down in 1954, in May of 1954, Thurgood Marshall and other NAACP leaders held a press conference. They said, okay, we've won school desegregation. Now we're going to turn our attention to housing. They had no idea of the massive resistance that was going to follow to the school desegregation decision. So they never had the resource really to fully turn their attention to housing.
Yeah. It seems like a really sad testament to how the mechanisms of maintaining racial inequality evolve. Once you feel like you're made progress on one front, another front evolves and deeply entrenches itself in our society.
Well, it's sad. It is very sad, but I'm also very hopeful. The Black Lives Matter demonstrations that engaged more than 20 million Americans, many of them white, who have come for the first time to an understanding of racial inequality and its causes and the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race in this country than we ever have had before in American history. So out of that discussion, a new civil rights movement could emerge that could redress the residential segregation that we have and the consequences in education and healthcare and criminal justice and in our politics that flow from it. I'm not confident, but I'm hopeful. Yeah. And I hope that you young people can see this come to fruition and see a less segregated society in the future.
Yeah. I gotta tell you, I have to say, I love to read history. I think it's really, really important. But reading history is depressing. I'm gonna be honest. Just seeing the evolutions and seeing the changes and seeing the progress, and then we are pushed back and pushed back. It just seems like we're caught in some really horrible cycles. But I'm gonna go with you and be hopeful, and things can change. Hopefully, I don't know.
Well, let me say that I think this history is encouraging. It's not depressing.
Okay.
Knowing this history, because so long as we thought it happened by accident, we can only think it can unhappen by accident. Once we understand how it happened, it gives us much more opportunity to fix it. So knowing this history is empowering, and I'm hopeful that it will lead to real change.
Okay, I'll force myself to reframe the way that I approach these texts. All right, so I had a question about school segregation. I'm a big fan of Nicole Hannah-Jones and the work that she does at the New York Times. And when I've been reading her articles, and it struck me that would it ever be possible for us to have functionally equal schools, schools that get equal funding and that are able to educate Black children and white children the same, but have residential segregation still be in place? Is there any way that we could create legislation that would make that a thing?
Well, of course, anything's possible. But in my view, the best way to create equality of education is to create equality of the neighborhoods where those schools are located. So long as we concentrate the most disadvantaged children in single schools, where the problems I was describing earlier, the health problems, the economic insecurity, the stress, the neighborhood conditions, create conditions that lead to lower achievement. So long as we allow those things to persist, I think it's unlikely. Now, I've actually written about how we could improve schools to, as you describe, so that the outcomes would be equal without addressing residential segregation. When I was an education policy writer, I did it. I costed out a program of what it would cost to do that. But the costs are enormous. The costs are enormous. We now provide a little bit of extra funding to schools serving disadvantaged children. The extra funding that we provide today is a tiny, tiny fraction of what would be required to try to overcome in schools the conditions that are not created in schools. So in theory, it's possible, I guess, but in practice, if we really want children to thrive, and I'm talking about typical children. Of course, there are always exceptions. There are always exceptions, and people who don't understand these things always point to the exceptions. And if there's one, if there's one batter who can hit 60 home runs in a year, everybody can do it. There's a distribution of outcomes for every group. There are some African American children who thrive and will do better than all others. There's a distribution. But on average, we can't solve these problems in schools. We need to solve these problems in communities. And so long as we maintain segregated communities, it's virtually impossible to solve them.
Yeah. And you shouldn't have to be exceptional to have access to a quality education.
Well, I want to say I don't. Many African American, maybe most African American children do have access to a quality education. Their low achievement is not the fault of the education that they're receiving. We have this myth that that if a school has high test scores, it's a better school than a school that has low test scores. If you go into schools in Black neighborhoods, you'll see some wonderful teaching going on. You'll see a quality education. But if you have a child who's coming to school in stress, homeless, poorly nourished, in poor health, no matter how high the quality of education is, that child is unlikely to thrive. So I think we make a big mistake when we think that the quality of schools is reflected by the outcomes of the children who go to those schools.
But isn't it also about access to resources? If our public education system is funded by property taxes, that means that these schools are not getting new textbooks. That means that the actual school buildings themselves are crumbling and deteriorating. That means I'm from Oklahoma. I don't live there now, but I know that the public education system in Oklahoma is just a mess because teachers despite their best efforts, don't have what they need to enable their students to thrive.
That's true. That's true. But most schools in urban areas today serving predominantly low-income Black children actually get more money than middle-class schools per pupil.
Oh, interesting.
They get more money. They don't get more money from state and local funds because of the property tax dependency of schools. But once you add federal funds to it, the per pupil spending in take New York City. New York City spends, $12,000 per pupil now, on average, on children in those schools. That's more than most middle-class schools get out in the suburbs. It's not more than the most affluent schools, the schools serving only the richest kids in the country, but it's more than the typical middle-class school. But it's not nearly enough. as I said before, if you really wanted to get the kind of achievement out of Black children that you get from children who come to school well rested and in good health and in secure homes, you'd have to multiply that. You'd have to provide all kinds of services that have nothing to do with the quality of education. You'd have to provide after-school programs that are not just homework help, that give children the kind of access to, art and music classes and co-op and civics groups, student government, all kinds of things that we don't spend attention to. What we've done in an attempt to cover this up is we've redirected all of our money in schools serving low-income children to math and reading drills. That's an exaggeration, not all of it. But, we've eliminated physical education. We've eliminated arts and music classes. We've eliminated. So in order to really do all those things and have the kind of quality education and the basic skills that we'd have to have much, much more money than we're even spending now in those low-income schools. So I think it's, like I said, it's in theory possible to do it. But in practice, unless we improve the conditions in which children come to school, we're not going to succeed in getting the kind of achievement that we need.
Do you think the fact that our neighborhoods are so segregated contributes to a lack of political will around addressing these modes of inequality? Like, if there were more integration, then would the people who have the most power and the most resources be more invested in making sure that all children have the best chance at thriving?
Well, I think so. As I said earlier, I think that the segregation that we have contributes to a political polarization.
Yeah. Okay, my last question is going to be about gentrification. So there are a growing number of neighborhoods that were previously mostly or exclusively Black and Latino that white people are moving back into. And when white folks move into those neighborhoods, they fundamentally change the character of the neighborhood, but not necessarily in a way that makes those Black and Latino residents safer. So what can be done about that?
Well, I think gentrification could be a great thing. If gentrification created communities that had a mix of affluent, moderate income, working class, and low income housing, that's what we want. What's happening with gentrification typically is that it changes a community over time from being a low income segregated community to a high income segregated community. And the existing residents are displaced because they can no longer afford to live in the places that they have traditionally lived in. That's not happening everywhere, but it's happening in a number of places. And we know what the policies are to prevent that effect. We know very well what they are. We're not doing them, but we know what the policies are. We should have very rigorous rent control in places like that. We should have limits on condominium conversions. We should have inclusionary zoning policies that require a share of all new developments to have units not only for the low-income families, but for moderate and working-class families as well. And we should have a freeze on property taxes for existing homeowners, because we have in these gentrifying communities, African-American and Latino homeowners in particular, who may have fully paid off their homes, but can no longer afford to live in them because the property taxes are rising as the value of the neighborhood increases. So we should freeze the property taxes on existing homeowners. These policies could create healthier communities out of gentrifying communities that are open both to previous residents and to the gentrifiers. What's missing, as I've said before, is a civil rights movement that's going to demand the implementation of these policies. But it's also inevitable that some people will be displaced. We can preserve housing for large numbers of the previous residents through the policies I just described, but some people will be displaced. And what we also have to do is make sure that when they get displaced, they're displaced to healthier neighborhoods, not to newly segregated places farther away from their communities that they've occupied. And that requires a whole range of other policies that we've talked about earlier.
Right.
So we know what to do. We're not doing it, and it will take a political movement
Right.
to make sure that we do it.
Because now, if I remember correctly, now more and more Black and Latino people are moving out to suburbs, but they don't have access to transportation. There's no like public goods, social services. And so it's like they're on an island. Like it exacerbates the inequality that they experience.
Well, and what's also happening is these are inner ring suburbs that African Americans are moving into. It's always been the case that African Americans, as their population has expanded, have moved to the next area out from the communities where they lived. And that's happening now. But unfortunately, those neighborhoods where African Americans are moving, the inner ring suburbs, are in transition. They're also, because we're not stabilizing them with good housing policies, we're not stabilizing them, they're becoming newly segregated African American neighborhoods. And one of the important things we need to do is implement policies that stabilize integration where it exists, because there's a period of time where those are integrated neighborhoods. But we need to put a lot more resources into those neighborhoods in order to stabilize their integration.
Okay. Last thing, is it correct that schools now are more segregated than they were 45 years ago?
Oh, yes, because the neighborhoods in which they're located are more segregated.
Yeah. It's so interesting. We like to think of racial progress as something that's linear, and that's just not true.
In some areas it is. In some places we've made enormous racial progress. In some areas we've not.
You're giving me glass half full. I appreciate it. Okay, yes, this is what I need. Yes. Yeah. Well, that's all I have, Mr. Rothstein. I appreciate you enormously. I, again, enjoyed this book, and I recommend anybody who wants to know more about the history of legal segregation in this country read it.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure talking to you. Thank
y'all so much for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. You know what I realized? These videos are so long that I'm just going to go ahead and put audio-only episodes up on the Patreon. So if you don't want to have to watch, if you just want to be able to listen in your car or on your walk, it's going to be over there. Shout out to the patrons. Shout out to the members. I appreciate you enormously. Leave a comment down below. Hit me up on Instagram or Twitter. Buy some merch. Sign up for the email newsletter. You guys, a pandemic, it's still raging. And now, all across the globe, we're about to see a second wave, and that is freaking scary. Stay safe. Wear a mask. Social distance if you can. I'll see you next time. Bye.